They laughed when Janet, at 76 years old, pressed that brass compass against her chest and walked toward the dense forest. Her neighbors said age had finally won, and the mining company's lawyers were taking bets on how long a crazy old woman would survive alone in those mountains. But what none of those arrogant men realized was that Janet was not lost. She was following the only instrument in the world that doesn't point to magnetic north, but toward an empire of secrets that power and greed had tried to bury 8 decades ago. 3 days later, the laughter in town stopped abruptly, because when Janet returned, she did not bring back only the dust of 3 days in the forest. She brought documents worth more than everything the mining company had ever dreamed of possessing. You won't believe what that compass revealed beneath the roots of the oldest tree in the forest. What Janet found changed the history of that town and proved, once and for all, that some women grow more powerful with time, not weaker. And if this is your first time here, and before we go any further, consider hitting that subscribe button, because every week on this channel, we tell the stories of people who prove that the best chapters of life haven't been written yet. Now, let's begin. The town of Millhaven, Montana, sat in a valley between 2 mountain ranges, like something that had been forgotten by the modern world and had quietly decided to be fine with that. Population, 840, according to the sign at the edge of town, though that number had been optimistic for at least 15 years. The general store had been the general store since 1952. The church on the hill had been the church on the hill since before anyone currently alive could remember. The one traffic light in town blinked yellow after 9 in the evening, because there was simply no reason for it to do anything else. Janet Calloway had lived in Millhaven for 51 of her 76 years, which meant she had arrived as a young woman of 25 and had stayed through every version of the town it had been since then. The prosperous years when the timber operation brought work, the difficult years when it closed, the cautious recovery, the slow settling into something smaller and quieter, and, to Janet's way of thinking, more honest than it had ever been before. She lived on 12 acres at the eastern edge of town, a property that included the house where she had raised 2 children, a barn that no longer housed animals but was filled instead with decades of her father's research materials, and a tree line that marked the beginning of federal forest that stretched unbroken for 40 miles into the mountains. The house needed paint. The fence along the road needed 2 new posts. The gutters had been on her list for 3 years. None of this bothered her particularly. She had learned over the course of a long life to distinguish between things that mattered and things that merely required attention, and a house needing paint was firmly in the second category. What mattered was the compass. It sat on the kitchen table most mornings beside her coffee cup in the particular beam of early light that came through the east window between 7 and 8. It was brass, approximately 3 inches in diameter, with a hand-engraved case that showed a mountain range on one face, the specific ridgeline she could see from her back porch on clear mornings, and a single line of text on the other, for the one who knows how to listen. The engraving was her father's work, done with the same meticulous hand that had filled 43 journals, and it had worn smooth in the spots where she had touched it most often over the decades. The hinge was tight. The glass over the face was original and uncracked. Whatever her father had built this instrument from, he had built it to last longer than he would. He had pressed it into her hands the summer she turned 18, 3 weeks before his death, with the instruction that she was not to use it until she understood what it was. It had taken her 30 years to understand what it was. Elliot Calloway had been a geologist of the unconventional variety, the kind that the academic establishment of the 1940s and 1950s had regarded with a mixture of respect and discomfort, because his methods produced results that his methods could not, the standards of the day, have produced. He mapped subsurface formations with an accuracy that conventional survey equipment of the era could not match. He identified mineral deposits that other geologists missed entirely. He once located an underground water source in a region that 3 separate surveys had declared bone dry, a fact that had saved the town of Millhaven during the drought of 1953, and that the town had largely forgotten by 1963. He had also spent the last 12 years of his life building something in the mountains. Janet knew this the way she knew most things about her father, not from what he had told her directly, because Elliot Calloway had not been a man who explained himself to people who weren't ready to understand, but from the accumulated evidence of a childhood spent watching him, the trips into the mountains that lasted 3 days, sometimes 5, the crates that arrived from addresses in 4 different states, contents listed on the manifests as scientific equipment, the correspondence with names she had spent years researching, engineers, architects, botanists, a woman who had been one of the first female chemists employed by the federal government, the coded journals, 43 of them, filling 3 shelves in the barn. She had spent 20 years decoding those journals. She had finished the last one 4 months ago, on a Tuesday morning in February, sitting at the kitchen table with her second cup of coffee growing cold beside her, and when she understood what she had read, she had sat very still for a long time, looking at the brass compass, before she allowed herself to think about what came next. What came next was complicated by the arrival, 6 weeks later, of Hargrove Extraction. They came the way companies like that always come. First a letter, then a representative, then a lawyer, then a different lawyer, then an offer. The offer was for the mineral rights to every property in Millhaven and the surrounding valley, and it was constructed with the careful generosity of an amount that sounded significant to people who weren't accustomed to thinking in the terms that Hargrove Extraction thought in: $40,000 per acre for mineral rights. Retain the property. Keep the house. Sign here. Janet's neighbors signed. Most of them signed within the first 2 weeks. Clarence Biggs, who had farmed the land next to hers for 30 years, signed on a Wednesday and came over that evening to tell her she was making a mistake. The Hendersons signed. The Pattersons signed. Old Tom Waverley, who had once told Janet he would rather burn his property to the ground than sell it to a corporation, signed on a Friday and had a new truck in his driveway by the following Monday. Janet did not. This produced a predictable response. The first lawyer, a man named Briggs who wore suits that cost more than most Millhaven residents made in a month, visited 3 times with incrementally larger numbers and incrementally less patience. The second lawyer, a younger man named Preston Cale, who had the particular energy of someone who had been told he was exceptionally talented too many times, visited twice with language that edged carefully toward legal threat without quite arriving there. The representative from corporate, a woman named Dana Whitfield, who had the smooth impenetrability of someone who had been trained to seem reasonable while being entirely inflexible, visited once and left Janet a folder of materials that Janet read carefully and then placed in the recycling bin. Through all of this, Janet was polite. She offered coffee. She listened. She asked questions that were more precise than the lawyers expected and required more precise answers than they were comfortable giving. And then she declined, each time, in the same terms. She was not interested in selling, and she wouldn't be changing her mind. The laughter started somewhere around the 3rd visit. She heard it first from Preston Cale, who made a remark to someone on his phone as he was getting into his car, something about the stubborn old bird that he clearly thought she couldn't hear from the porch. She was 76, not deaf. She heard it from Clarence Biggs, who had taken to stopping by with a frequency that was less about neighborliness than about the $500 referral bonus Hargrove was apparently offering to anyone who brought in a holdout. She heard it from her own grandchildren. That last one was the one that required the most careful management. Daniel and Cora were her son Michael's children, 28 and 25 respectively, both living in Billings, both carrying the specific impatience of young adults who have decided that their elders' resistance to practical reality is a form of stubbornness rather than a form of knowledge. They drove up on a Saturday in April, with the barely concealed agenda of people who believe they are being helpful while pursuing their own interests, and sat at her kitchen table with the brass compass between them on the surface, and said things like, "Grammy, we're worried about you, and this is a real opportunity, and the property is worth more with the mineral rights sale than without them, and you know the house is going to need a lot of work." Janet listened to all of it. She looked at her grandchildren, Daniel with his father's jaw and his mother's nervous energy, Cora, with the quick intelligence that had always been there and that Janet had always trusted more than Cora trusted it herself, and she felt the complicated love of a person who sees both what someone is and what they could be if they were given the right kind of room to grow. "I appreciate you coming," she said, when they had finished. "I know you made a long drive." "Grammy," Daniel started. "The compass isn't she said. "The property is not for sale, and I am not confused about what I am doing." She looked at them both steadily. "I'd like you to trust me the way I have trusted you over the years, when you made decisions I didn't fully understand." The drive back to Billings had apparently involved a phone call to their father, because Michael called that evening with a tone that was trying to be gentle and landing somewhere closer to patronizing. Janet told him she loved him and changed the subject, and after the call she sat on the back porch for a while in the cooling evening and looked at the tree line and thought about her father. She thought about the journals. She thought about the names in the correspondence, the engineers, the architects, the botanist from Oregon, the chemist from Washington. She thought about the summer of 1944, which appeared in the journals with a frequency that indicated something significant had happened, and about the winter of 1947, and about a specific formation that her father described in 3 separate journals using 3 different sets of coordinates that all pointed to the same location. She picked up the compass from the porch railing where she'd set it down and felt it do what it did, the slight resistance, the pull that was not magnetic, the particular settling that she had spent 30 years learning to read. She looked at the tree line. 3 days, the last journal had said. 3 days if you know the terrain. 4 if the creek is running high. She went inside and began to pack. She moved through the house with the efficiency of someone who has done hard things before and knows what is necessary and what is not. The pack came down from the hall closet shelf, where it had lived for a decade, frame still sound, straps still adjusted to her dimensions. She checked the water filtration system. Intact. She restocked the first aid kit from the medicine cabinet with the attention of someone who doesn't plan to need it, but intends to have it. She packed her father's hand-drawn map in a waterproof sleeve. She packed the camera. She packed 3 days of food in the compact, high-calorie form that she had learned in a lifetime of mountain walking to prefer over quantity. She set the compass beside the pack, ready for morning. Then she sat at the kitchen table for the last time that evening and opened the final journal to the last page she had decoded, the one that had sent her out to the porch and then back inside with a certainty that had been building for 30 years and had finally quietly arrived. She left on a Tuesday morning before anyone was awake to watch her go, which was by design. The sun was not yet fully above the eastern ridge, and the air had the particular sharpness of Montana mornings in late May, cold enough to require the layers she'd packed, warm enough that by midday she would be glad she'd packed lightly. She carried a frame pack that she'd bought in 1987 and maintained carefully ever since because she had learned that quality equipment kept well is worth more than new equipment kept poorly. The pack contained 3 days of food, a water filtration system, a first aid kit, a hand-drawn map compiled from her father's journals, a waterproof case containing the most important documents from his research, and the compass. She did not carry a didn't-tone. This was a choice that she anticipated people would interpret as evidence of her incompetence, but which was in fact a deliberate decision. Cell service ended at the tree line anyway, and a device that worked for the first quarter mile and then became dead weight was not worth carrying it. She carried instead a compass, a knowledge of terrain that she had been building since childhood, and 40 years of experience in these specific mountains. She also carried, though she would not have described this way to anyone, the accumulated patience of a woman who had spent 3 decades waiting for the right moment and had finally identified it. The first day was straightforward. She followed the creek bed for the initial 4 miles, which her father's journals described as the walking, the portion of the journey that required nothing more than the willingness to put one foot in front of the other. The terrain was familiar to her through most of it. She had walked this land hundreds of times over the years, knew which sections flooded in spring and which stayed passable, knew where the deer trails cut through the undergrowth and could be followed for a mile before they curved off in the wrong direction. The compass was calm for most of that first day, It did what it had always done in familiar territory, maintained a steady orientation that was not quite north, not quite northwest, but something in between that her father had described in his journals as the third direction. She checked it every hour or so, not because she needed to navigate by it, but because she had learned that the compass communicated in degrees of stillness as much as in degrees of direction, and she wanted to know when it began to change. It began to change at the end of the first day. When she made camp near a rock formation, she recognized from her father's sketches the needle, which was not a standard magnetic needle, but a custom-machined piece of her father's own design, the specifications for which occupied an entire journal, began to show the slight vibration that she had learned, over years of careful observation, indicated proximity to what her father called a resonant zone, not a large vibration. Not the spinning she knew was coming, just the first indication that the instrument was beginning to communicate something more specific than direction. She made a fire, ate, studied the hand-drawn map, and went to sleep. The second day was harder. The terrain above the rock formation climbed steeply and stayed steep, switchbacking through old-growth timber that blocked the sun in ways that made navigation by conventional means difficult. This was, she suspected, not accidental. Her father had been a man who understood that the best protection for something valuable was the natural difficulty of reaching it. She used the compass continuously through the morning, checking it every 20 minutes, learning to read the relationship between the needle's behavior and the terrain under her feet. She fell once, on a section of trail that had been washed out by winter runoff and had not recovered. She caught herself on her hands, assessed the damage, scraped palms, bruised knee, dignity intact, and kept moving. She was 76 years old, and she was alone on a mountain, and she had fallen, which was a fact. She dealt with facts. She did not catastrophize, didn't by midday of the second day. The compass needle was spinning. Not constantly. It would spin for 30 seconds, then settle to a new orientation, then spin again as she moved across the terrain. Her father described this in the journals as the instrument reading the deep structure, which was his characteristically oblique way of saying that the subsurface geology was doing something that the compass was designed to detect. She slowed her pace significantly and began paying attention to the ground beneath her feet in a different way, looking for the signs her father had described: changes in vegetation density, shifts in soil color, the particular way sound moved differently over certain underground formations. She found the first sign in the middle of the afternoon, a section of forest floor where the undergrowth was different. Not absent, different. The plant species were the same, but they were larger, more vigorous, growing with the particular energy of plants that have access to resources that their neighbors don't. Her father had described this exact pattern in Journal 31. She stopped and took a reading. The compass needle was pointing at 47 degrees off her current bearing toward a section of hillside that appeared, from where she stood, to be solid rock face overgrown with decades of vegetation. She made camp there at the base of the rock face and spent the evening studying the stone. The third day she found the door. It was not visible from any angle that a casual observer would have used. The rock face, when examined from the particular position that the compass directed her to, standing at a specific distance, oriented at a specific angle, at the specific time of morning, when the light came from the east at low elevation, revealed what appeared to be a natural formation but was not. The horizontal wasn't at, she had been telling herself, was a geological stratum was too precise. The vertical crack that she had been telling herself was normal fracture was too clean. And the vegetation pattern, the way the old-growth tree roots ran along the base of the formation, was consistent not with natural rock, but with something that had been set in place and then allowed to weather for many decades. The roots of the largest tree, a Douglas fir that her father's journals estimated at 200 years old, ran along the base of the formation in a way that had, over 80 years, grown around and partially obscured a seam in the rock that was the outline of a door. Janet spent 40 minutes clearing the base of the seam with the folding tool she'd brought for exactly this purpose. She was not in a hurry. She had not come this far in 3 days to rush the last 10 minutes. She worked methodically, the way she did everything, removing debris and growth with the care of someone who understood that what she was uncovering had been built by hands she respected. The mechanism, when she found it, was exactly where her father's final journal said it would be, a recessed panel behind a loose stone 3 feet to the right of the door seam, at knee height. The panel contained a socket that was exactly the diameter of the compass casing. Janet looked at the compass in her hand. She looked at the socket. She thought about her father, about the particular quality of his mind, the way he had thought 40 years ahead, the way he had trusted that the right person would find this eventually, and that the right person would have what they needed to open it. She pressed the compass into the socket. There was a sound, deep, mechanical, the sound of something that had been waiting a very long time being asked to do what it was made to do, a series of clicks, deliberate and sequential, like a combination lock working through its sequence. Then a release of air that was not dramatic but was unmistakable, the pressure differential of a sealed space opening for the first time in decades. The door swung inward on hinges that moved smoothly, despite 80 years of disuse, because her father had engineered them to last, and had used materials that the standards of the 1940s did not commonly use, and that she had spent years identifying from his journal descriptions. The air that came out was cool and dry, and carried a smell that she could not immediately name, couldn't lightly metallic, with something underneath it that reminded her of the inside of the old county library when she was a child, the smell of preserved things. She took a flashlight from her pack, held it in front of her, and stepped inside. The passage ran downward at a gentle grade for approximately 30 feet before opening into something that stopped her entirely. She had prepared herself intellectually for what her father's journals described. She had read the descriptions carefully, cross-referenced the measurements, constructed a mental model of the space based on 43 journals worth of documentation. She believed she understood what she was walking into. She had not, it turned out, understood at all. Reading about it was not the same as standing inside it. The chamber was large. Her father's journal said 60 feet by 80, and standing in it she believed that now in a way she had not quite believed it before. The ceiling was reinforced concrete, arched in a design that distributed load in a way she recognized from the structural engineering journals he'd referenced. The walls were lined with what appeared to be a combination of storage shelving and equipment bays, most of them sealed behind glass panels that had kept their integrity across 8 decades. The floor was smooth and clean and dry. The air, fed by a ventilation system that was still operating on the passive airflow design her father had engineered, was remarkably fresh, and it was not empty. The storage bays held what her father's journals had described as the primary archive, the accumulated research of a group of 12 scientists, engineers, and specialists who had spent 8 years working together toward a specific goal. She walked the perimeter slowly, flashlight moving across sealed containers labeled in her father's handwriting and in other handwriting she didn't recognize. Seeds, thousands of them, sealed in conditions designed for century-scale preservation. Soil samples from regions her father had mapped, water samples, rock samples, chemical compounds whose formulas occupied 3 full shelves of documentation. But it was the technical archive that held her longest. Her father's group had been, in the nomenclature of their era, working on what they called recovery infrastructure, systems designed to function after a catastrophic disruption to normal civilization. Not weapons, not military technology. Infrastructure, water purification systems designed to operate without external power, soil restoration techniques for land that had been damaged by industrial extraction, seed preservation methods, structural designs for buildings that could be built from locally available materials with minimal equipment. The work of people who had looked at the world in 1944 and asked not, how do we win, but how do we rebuild if everything goes wrong? Some of it was the technology of its era, dated, superseded by subsequent decades of development, but some of it was not. Her father's work on WHHE, called resonant extraction, using the natural electromagnetic properties of certain mineral formations to generate usable power, occupied 11 of the 43 journals and had been her most difficult decoding project. Standing in the chamber with his original equipment in front of her, She understood it in a way she had not understood it from the journals alone. It was not the technology that had superseded this work. It was the economics. His approach required no external fuel source, no combustion, no byproduct extraction. It was, in the terminology that had not existed in 1944, but that she knew well now, a clean energy system derived from naturally occurring geological phenomena. The patents, her father's and those of his collaborators, 11 of them, were in a sealed case on the center table. She had known they would be there. The final journal had described them in precise terms: who had filed them, when, under what corporate structure, and what had happened to that corporate structure when the group's work was interrupted by events she had spent years researching. She sat down on a wooden chair that was still solid after 80 years and read the documents by flashlight for 2 hours. The chair was pine, mortise and tenon construction, the kind that was built in an era when furniture was made to outlast its owners. It didn't creak. The table it sat before was the same, solid, simple, made by hands that had been thinking about permanence when they worked. She thought about the people who had built this place, who had carried these materials into the mountain and assembled them in the dark, who had filed the patents and written the documents and arranged everything with the careful attention of people who could not be certain their work would ever be found, but who refused to leave it incomplete. 12 people. Her father was one of them. The others were names she had spent years researching, names from the correspondence, from the institutional records, from the footnotes of academic papers where their work had been cited without attribution. They had been, in the taxonomy of their era, unconventional. They had been, in the taxonomy of hers, visionary. The distinction was mostly a matter of timing. By the time she stood up, she knew 3 things with the certainty of someone who has done her homework. First, the patents, while old, covered methods and approaches that were currently being rediscovered by contemporary researchers, which meant they were not obsolete curiosities, but active intellectual property with significant commercial relevance. Second, the corporate structure her father's group had established, the Callaway Hatch Research Consortium, had never been dissolved. It had simply been inactive, and inactive was not the same as non-existent. Third, as the sole living direct descendant of the founding member, and as the holder of the physical key that the consortium's own founding documents specified as the instrument of succession, she was the legal inheritor of everything in this room. She picked up the compass, looked at it for a moment, and put it in her breast pocket. Then she made a careful inventory of the chamber, documented everything she could with the small camera she'd brought, sealed the door behind her, and began the walk back to Millhaven. She was not in a hurry. She had waited 30 years. She could wait 3 more days. She came out of the forest on a Friday morning, which was not planned but was, she thought after, was appropriate. Friday being the end of something and the beginning of something else. A threshold day. Preston Cale's car was in her driveway. She observed this from the tree line without moving for a moment, taking in the scene, the silver sedan, the man in the expensive suit standing on her porch with the specific impatience of someone who believes their time is more valuable than the time of the person they are waiting for. She recognized the posture. She had seen it 3 times before. It communicated a certainty about the order of things that she had spent 76 years quietly declining to confirm. She walked across the field toward the house. He saw her when she was about 50 yards out and straightened up with an expression that moved through surprise, then relief, then something that settled into the particular condescension of a man who has been made to wait and intends to make that felt. Mrs. Callaway. He came down the porch steps toward her. Your family has been very concerned. 3 days with no contact. Good morning, Mr. Cale, she said. She walked past him and up the steps and opened the front door. Would you like coffee? She could hear him recalibrating behind her. She had found over the years that the simple act of behaving as though the situation were entirely normal was the most disorienting thing she could do to a person who had arrived expecting drama. She set her pack down, washed her hands, and put the kettle on. Preston Cale came inside and stood in her kitchen with his briefcase in his hand and his script slightly misaligned. Hargrove has authorized me to present a final offer, he said. It's substantially higher than the previous. "I don't need coffee myself," she said. "I have everything I need. But you're welcome to a cup." He stared at her. "Mrs. Calloway, this is a final offer. After this point, the company will be pursuing legal avenues to—" "Mr. Cale." She turned to face him. She was 5 feet 4 inches tall and 76 years old, and had dirt on her boots from 3 days in the mountains, and she looked at him with the eyes that her grandchildren called steel grey, and that she had inherited from a father who had built an empire in a mountain and waited 40 years for someone he trusted to find it. "I'd like you to leave my property, please. I'll be in touch with you very shortly through my own legal representative." "Your legal—" He blinked. "Mrs. Calloway, with all due respect, I don't think you understand the complexity of—" "I understand the complexity quite well," she said. "Better, in fact, than you do at this moment. I've had a productive week. I have things to attend to, please." She held the door open. He left, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the specific frustration of a man who had lost a confrontation he had not realized he was in. She closed the door and called her daughter-in-law, who was an attorney in Helena and whom she had trusted for 30 years. She spoke for 22 minutes. She described precisely and completely what she had found and what she understood its legal status to be. Her daughter-in-law was quiet for a moment at the end of this recitation. Then she said, "Janet, I'm going to need to make some calls." "I know," Janet said. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." The calls took 11 days. During those 11 days, Janet continued her life in Millhaven with the unperturbed consistency that had always characterized her, tending the garden, reading, walking the property line each morning with the compass in her pocket. The Hargrove representatives appeared twice more, once with a larger number, once with what she interpreted as a veiled suggestion that her mental competence might be called into question if she continued to resist. She documented both visits carefully, dated and timed, as her daughter-in-law had instructed. Daniel and Cora drove up again on the second weekend, this time with their father. Michael Calloway was 61 years old and had his mother's grey eyes and his father's stubbornness deployed in entirely different directions, and he sat at the kitchen table with the expression of a man who has been frightened and is expressing it as frustration. "Mum, I need you to explain to me what's happening," he said. "I'm going to," she said. "But I need you to listen the way you listened when you were 9 years old, and I was teaching you to read a topographical map." Without deciding in advance what I'm going to say, he looked at her for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, something old and true coming back through the layer of worry and condescension that the years had deposited over it. He nodded. She told them. Not everything, not the details that were still being verified by her daughter-in-law's research, but enough. Enough for Michael to sit back in his chair with both hands flat on the table. Enough for Cora to stop taking notes on her phone and simply stare. Enough for Daniel to say quietly, "Grammy, are you serious?" in a tone entirely different from anything he had said during his previous visit. "I have been serious about this for 30 years, she said simply. "What changed is that I finally had all the information I needed." She looked at each of them in turn. Her son, her grandchildren, the people she had built her life around and who had, in their worry and their youth and their certainty that they knew better, laughed at her compass and her stubbornness and her refusal to accept an offer that they believed was the best she could do. She did not say any of this. She did not need, "Didn't that do you need us to do?" Michael asked. "Nothing, right now," she said. "I have a lawyer. I have documentation. I have the key." She set the compass on the table between them. "What I need from you is what I've always needed. Trust." The room was quiet. Outside, a late May wind moved through the pine trees at the property line. The compass sat on the table and did what it always did in her kitchen, the faint, barely perceptible orientation toward the mountain, so subtle that you had to know it was there to see it. Cora reached out and touched the brass casing gently, the way you touch something old and significant. She looked up at her grandmother. "I'm sorry we laughed," she said. "You didn't know what you didn't know," Janet said. "That's not the same as being wrong about who you are." The legal determination came on a Thursday, 18 days after Janet had returned from the mountain. She had spent those 18 days in a state she could only describe as methodical calm, the same state she had been in during the 3 days in the forest, during the 30 years of journal work, during every phase of a project that had required her to move at the speed of careful rather than the speed of urgent. She answered questions from Patricia's team, provided documentation from the barn archive when requested, walked the property line each morning, tended the garden. She slept well. Her daughter-in-law called at 8 in the morning with the tone of someone delivering news that they have checked 3 times because they were not sure they believed it. The Callaway Hatch Research Consortium was legally valid. The patents, while old, covered methods that were directly applicable to 3 separate technology streams currently under active commercial development, which meant their value was not historical but present and ongoing. The physical assets in the chamber, including the archive, the equipment, and the seed collection, constituted a collection of significant scientific and agricultural value, and the succession clause in the consortium's founding documents was, after review by 2 independent legal experts, exactly what Janet had said it was. She was, legally and unambiguously, the owner. She sat with this for a moment after the call ended, not with triumph. She was not a person who experienced events primarily as victories or defeats, but with the particular quiet of someone who has finished a very long task and is now sitting in the space where the task used to be. The space felt unexpectedly very large. She had been carrying the journals and the research and the compass and the knowledge of the mountain for so long that their absence left room she didn't quite know what to do with yet. She thought her father had probably felt something similar, somewhere in that mountain, when the last crate was installed and the door was sealed and there was nothing left to build. She made a cup of tea. She sat at the kitchen table. She looked at the compass. Then she picked up the phone and called Preston Cale. She chose the venue deliberately, the Millhaven Town Hall, which was a building that had served its community for 80 years and that Hargrove's initial development plans had marked for demolition. She requested a meeting with the company's regional director, not just the lawyers, and she specified a time and a date and a list of who she expected to be present. They came. She had not expected them to comply so readily, but understood it when she saw them file in. They were still operating on the assumption that this was a negotiation they were going to win, that the old woman with the brass compass was playing some kind of holdout game, and that the right combination of numbers and legal pressure would end it. They had not yet recalibrated. Regional Director Howard Marsh was 63 years old, grey-suited, and carried himself with the ease of someone who had spent a career being the most powerful person in most rooms. He sat at the head of the table, her table, in her meeting, in her town's building, and arranged his papers with the calm of someone who expected to be there for 30 minutes. Preston Cale was to his right. 3 other lawyers and 2 corporate representatives filled the remaining seats on that side. On Janet's side, her daughter-in-law, 2 specialists her daughter-in-law had retained, and Michael, who had asked to be there and whom she had allowed to come. Janet set the compass on the table in front of her. Marsh glanced at it with the expression of a man who has heard about the compass and has decided in advance that it is a prop in an old woman's eccentricity. "Mrs. Callaway," he said, with the warmth of someone who has been coached to seem reasonable, "I appreciate you agreeing to meet. I think we can resolve this situation to everyone's benefit today." "I agree," she said. He proceeded with the offer. It was, she had to acknowledge, a significant number, larger than anything they had previously presented, constructed with the careful architecture of something designed to be difficult to refuse. Mineral rights acquisition, property purchase option, a community fund that was clearly designed to make the acceptance seem like civic responsibility. She let him finish. "Thank you," she said. "I'd like to share something with you." Her daughter-in-law slid a document across the table. She watched Marsh pick it up. She watched the first page. She watched him turn to the second page and then the third, and she watched something change in his face, the particular recalibration of a man who has just realized that the room he is in is not the room he thought he was in. "This is, he looked up. "This can't be." "It's been verified by 2 independent legal experts and a patent attorney," her daughter-in-law said. "The documentation is complete." Marsh looked at the compass on the table. He looked at Janet. She watched him work through it. The old woman, the compass, the 3 days in the forest. The thing that everyone had decided was the harmless fixation of someone whose grip on practical reality had loosened with age. The patents alone, her daughter-in-law continued, are the subject of ongoing discussions with 3 technology companies that are developing systems in directly adjacent areas. The archive has been assessed by a curator from the University of Montana as a collection of significant historical and scientific value. The Seed Collection. I understand what the documents say, Marsh said quietly. He had gone very still. Then you understand, Janet said, that the conversation we're having today is not the conversation you arrived expecting to have. She paused. Hargrove wants to extract minerals from this valley. I understand that. Some of those minerals may be valuable, but my father spent 8 years of his life building something in that mountain that is worth more than minerals. And the reason it's worth more is that it was designed to restore rather than extract. She looked at Marsh steadily. I have a proposal for you. He looked at her. Not a sale, she said. A partnership. Hargrove has the infrastructure and the capital. I have the intellectual property and the location. My father's work on resonant extraction is directly applicable to Hargrove's operational footprint. It would reduce your energy costs and eliminate a significant portion of your environmental liability. She let that land. I've had it assessed. The numbers are in the second document. He picked up the second document. The room was very quiet. Preston Cale was looking at the table. The corporate representatives were looking at Marsh. Michael was looking at his mother with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone revising a story they thought they already knew. Marsh read the second document for a long time. Then he set it down and looked at Janet Calloway, 76 years old, 5 feet 4 inches, with the brass compass on the table in front of her, and the steady eyes of a woman who had spent 30 years preparing for this conversation. And he said, "What kind of partnership?" The agreement took 4 months to finalize. Janet's daughter-in-law negotiated with the patience and precision that had made her one of the most respected attorneys in Helena, and Janet participated in every session, asking the questions that needed to be asked and declining the terms that needed to be declined, and accepting the terms that served her purposes. Hargrove's legal team was professional and thorough, and ultimately she thought somewhat relieved. The technology her father's consortium had developed was genuinely valuable to them, and a licensing agreement was a considerably cleaner path than the extraction and demolition plan they had arrived in Millhaven with. The agreement, when it was signed, contained several elements that had not been in Hargrove's original plans. The Millhaven properties that had already sold their mineral rights, Clarence Biggs's farm, the Henderson Place, the Patterson land, were included in a community stewardship framework that ensured a percentage of the licensing revenue would fund a land restoration program. Old Tom Waverley, when he heard about this, showed up at Janet's door on a Saturday morning and stood on her porch and said, "I shouldn't have sold," in the tone of someone stating a fact rather than asking for absolution. Janet made him coffee and agreed, and they sat for an hour talking about the valley as it had been and as it might still be. The chamber in the mountain was professionally documented and sealed, with the university team from Missoula handling the archival work. The seed collection was transferred to a preservation facility, with the condition that a portion remain accessible to local farmers, a condition her father had specified in his journals, and that she insisted on over 3 rounds of negotiation. The resonant extraction technology, her father's life's work, the 11 journals, the decades of experimentation, entered a development partnership with Hargrove and 2 technology companies that her daughter-in-law had identified during the patent research. It would take years to reach commercial implementation. Janet had made her peace with that. Her father had built for the long term, and she had inherited that quality without fully knowing it, and she was not going to stop now. What changed in Millhaven happened more quietly than the dramatic reversals of fortune that stories are sometimes made of, but it happened. The demolition plans were withdrawn. The development footprint was reduced to a fraction of the original proposal. The community fund, negotiated to a specific and enforceable structure rather than the vague gesture it had originally been, began its first round of disbursements in November. The sign at the edge of town still said 840, but the people who read it now included, for the first time in 15 years, 3 families who had moved in rather than out. Janet walked the property line each morning, as she had for 50 years. The compass was in her pocket, as it had been since her father placed it in her hands when she was 18, and told her she would know what it was when she was ready. She was not always sure what she had been ready for. The journey, the discovery, the negotiation, or the discipline of being a person who does not mistake other people's certainty for truth. On a morning in early October, 6 months after the agreement was signed, she was walking the eastern edge of her land when she heard footsteps behind her. The sound was familiar in the way that the sounds of people you love are familiar. There is a rhythm to how a specific person moves that you carry in your memory without knowing you're carrying it, and you recognize it before you recognize anything else about them. She turned to find Cora, who had driven up from Billings without calling ahead, wearing hiking boots and carrying 2 cups of coffee. She was dressed for the weather in a way that suggested she had thought about it beforehand. Practical layers, the right kind of jacket for October mornings in Montana, and there was something in her posture that was different from the last time Janet had seen her. Something settled, something that looked from a distance and then up close, like a person who had done some thinking and had arrived somewhere on the other side of it. "I thought you might want company," Cora said. Janet looked at her granddaughter, 25 years old, with the quick intelligence that had always been there, and something else now, something that had come in over the past months, a quality of attention that was different from before, more patient, more willing to sit with what she didn't know rather than filling the space with what she did. "I do," Janet said. They walked together along the fence line, toward the tree line in the early October morning with the mountains visible to the east, in the particular clarity that Montana produces after a night of rain. The compass was still in Janet's pocket, oriented as it always was toward the mountain and whatever was in it. "Grammy," Cora said after a while, "the compass, did you always know what it was? When you were my age?" "No," Janet said. "I knew it was important. I didn't know what it was for." She paused. Some things take time to understand. The mistake people make is thinking that not understanding yet means it isn't worth understanding. Cora was quiet, considering this. "Dad said you spent 30 years decoding the journals," she said. "I did. Didn't that feel, didn't it feel like a long time to wait?" Janet looked at the tree line, at the mountains behind it, at the sky above that was the specific blue of early October at altitude. She thought about her father, about the journals, about the summer of 1944 and the winter of 1947, and the small compass pressed into an 18-year-old girl's hands with the instruction that she would know when she was ready. "It felt like preparation," she said. "There's a difference." They reached the corner of the property and stood for a moment looking east, into the forest, toward the mountain. The compass in her pocket was still. It had done its work. It was resting. "What does it feel like now?" Cora asked. Janet thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "It feels like the beginning of something," she said. "It usually does, when you've finished something difficult." She looked at her granddaughter, at the young woman who had driven 3 hours without calling and brought coffee and asked the right questions. Who was, Janet thought, more ready than she knew? "Keep walking with me," she said. Cora fell into step beside her, and they walked east together into the October morning, toward the tree line and the mountain beyond it, and everything that was still, even now, waiting to be understood. If you have ever been laughed at for knowing something that other people weren't ready to see, if you have ever carried something valuable in silence, waiting for the moment to be right, if you have ever been told that your time has passed when in fact it had not yet fully arrived, this story belongs to you, because Janet's compass did not point north. It pointed toward the truth, that patience and knowledge and the refusal to be defined by other people's limits will always, eventually, take you somewhere extraordinary. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that wisdom is not a consolation prize for getting older. It is the destination. This community understands that, and we are so grateful you walked this road with us today. We'll see you in the next story.